It's interesting when you see all these current events, you notice certain patterns and parallels, even to what I talk about in the book, even though I wrote it 5 years ago. You'll notice certain patterns in human behavior. People like to latch onto a narrative, and the narrative is easy to control. The establishment tells you who you can believe and who you can trust. And people, when I say people, I mean 99% of people, they go along with it and they don't question anything. It's true now about what's going on with Ukraine. That narrative is being controlled. It's not as simple as Putin bad, Russia innocent victims. It's not that complicated. It's not that simple at all. That place has always been divided. Ukraine has plenty of their own, problems with mistreating people. But we saw the same thing with COVID last year. The narrative was controlled. And it's a lot of, some of the struggles I went through in my struggle with my mental health. I was seeking treatment, and I noticed that, a lot of the same things we're talking about here, the narrative is controlled. And, one reason I wanted to write this book, well, not only did regular treatment, fail me, I wanted to get my story out there, and I want to make clear with my book, it's not anti-science, it's not an anti-medicine book. It's kind of filling in the blanks, because science has limits, just like anything else. Not only can the narrative be controlled, like I just said, but it can only do so much. Why have scientists never answered the question of, has God existed, or who is God? It's because science can't answer that. A lot of the struggles I went through, and mental health struggles in general, science can't answer it. And even if it was theoretically possible, the research can't be done because you don't have access to the population, or you don't have the right funding or whatnot. So the book is not anti-science. The book is trying to fill in the blanks the best we can. And once you learn to do that, you learn to do that in every step of life, with your own health or what's going on with current events. Once you get good at spotting truth and deceptions, you can smell it from a mile away. 99% of people will see what's going on with COVID or Ukraine and just go along with it. Guys like us can, stop, count to 10, and try to research the whole story. Okay, so yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I agree with all that, and I like your position as being neutral. I'm a little more aggressive on the, I feel that that science has been weaponized to a large degree, and it's been weaponized for a long time. And it's not that science itself as a practice is it's a bad thing. It's a tool. It could be used for bad or good, and it's being controlled, by interest groups that essentially are forcing it to do certain things, and those things are generally nefarious. They're there for manipulation, control. They're for profit, creating profits, and all of that is has been going on for a long time. If anybody is interested in how long this is going on, I recommend anybody go to just type in Edward Bernays' Propaganda. It's a 1928 written book by the nephew of Sigmund Freud, no less. And in the very first page, he will tell you that this is in 1928, before, we really had a lot of media at all. And he was basically laying out the framework of how the masses would be controlled in a modern society, and how their interests and their opinions would be manufactured. So this stuff goes back really, really far, and science is no different. Science has been essentially taken over and controlled, and so there's a lot of darkness in this kind of realm, and I think that in the psychiatric field, if you look at the history of psychiatrics, it's a pretty dark thing. What they were doing to come up with psychiatry and the methods to cure people are pretty archaic, and so that's a whole nother topic. But I think that somebody like you going through this natural process of becoming an adult, dealing with mental issues, dealing with certain structures of stress that, whether they be natural, they came from your own. You talk about in your book how there's a lot of natural tendencies of OCD that are very good. It's some people like to argue a lot. They can become lawyers, and some people that are,
use it to your advantage, right?
Right, use it to your advantage. And I think there's this idea that there's always something wrong with you no matter what, and they want to diagnose you. And if you look at the DSM-5 now, it's the bigger than the Bible, because they want every single thing that is natural to humankind to be labeled as some kind of disorder, so they can then pop a pill in you and make money and this kind of thing. So there is a dark side to it.
Right.
That doesn't mean that all science is bad, but we do have to
Of course.
discern how that's, how that's being played out. But I do want to start with you and your personal story. I know that you um, have a big history. You got a lot of education behind your belt. You're a very driven, motivated person. Tell me a little bit about your childhood and maybe how you came to realize a little more your self-awareness into your own personality, and what was the first moment that you kind of realized that you had this issue or these issues. And can you walk us through kind of your origin story a little bit, and how you at least became aware of all of this?
Right. So like I talk about in the opening of the book, OCD, it's like a conglomeration of different parts that all come together. It's not one thing. You have to have the different layers develop over time and then come together as a perfect storm. You know, you have to have anxiety, which I had, growing up in, very, strict religious household. My dad was very successful. You know, you have to have a obsessive brain, which, I did. You know, you have to have anxiety. You have to have, I think you have to have a lack of security. You have to feel not safe in certain ways, which I guess I had to an extent. Now, all these parts, if they existed independently, would not be a big deal. They just kind of all came together in a perfect storm in my late 20s. Whenever I hit a crossroads in my spiritual journey and decide, the really strict fundamental religious teachings that I was taught as a child, I don't necessarily believe it that way anymore. And then it just kind of all came crashing down, and I had to go back to the drawing board and kind of learn it all. Now, that's something that's not easy to do, obviously. And as we're talking, I do want to make one point clear. As I'm criticizing, to an extent, just the mental health industry in general, I'm not necessarily suggesting that it should be different, right? I don't think that somebody struggling with the early onset of OCD should go into a psychologist's office and be told, hey, you need to be willing to unlearn it all, go back to the beginning, right? And change your whole life if necessary, because vast majority of people can't handle that. It would be a disaster, right? So it goes back to what I was saying earlier. A lot of the concepts I'll talk about in my book are not designed to replace modern medicine or psychology. It's filling in the blanks, So that's essentially what it is. So as I was going through my journey, I'm a perfect example of somebody who just wasn't able to be treated in the system. If you name a psychological antidepressant, anti-anxiety drug, I took it. I took them all. I saw about 10 psychologists. I spent a month in a treatment center, and just none of that stuff did any good. No natural healers who had all the answers. No, nothing. My particular issue was something that only I could solve. And a lot of people in that situation don't know how to do it. So, with my book, I wanted to point people in the right direction if they're in a similar place. I had one guy write a review saying, well, the name of your book is How to Overcome OCD. And he didn't really tell me how. Well, yeah, I did. I told you that I'm going to teach you how to do it yourself. It's just like anything else you deal with fitness. You can't motivate somebody to show up to your sessions every week and get in shape. They have to be motivated themselves. So it's a similar thing. So I went through the system, didn't help me at all. So I had no choice. It's not like I'm an anti-science guy or anti-psychology. I have a degree in psychology, right? My mom is a clinical social worker. I'm not anti-establishment, but the establishment failed me. So I had no choice but to figure out another way. So the book is telling my own story, and it's also concepts that I think anybody can use to develop their own cure, like I mentioned a few times. Yeah, so that's essentially it. I mean, I didn't have a bad childhood. So if you read my book and talk about how bad I was for a couple years, it doesn't match the childhood I had. I had good parents. It was a good family. Went to private school, but like I said, all these different layers have to come together. It's just like a child who has a good upbringing, but they run into drug problems, and and then end up in the prison system as adults.
Correct. Yeah.
Sometimes it's just many different pieces of a puzzle coming together in a bad way.
So
Right.
what was the moment that you realized that you had a problem and you needed help? Was there a moment that you can remember, like some kind of traumatic moment or some kind of
Right.
you talk about
Yeah.
OCD at base as fear, and we were going to get into maybe that a little bit, like
Right.
unpacking what fear is and the idea of good fear versus bad fear, and but what was there a moment of reckoning, I guess you could say, that you said, my God, I have an issue I need to deal with, and that drove you to seek help?
Right. Well, it was progressive. It wasn't, it wasn't immediate. Just like any mental or health condition, it takes time to progress. So my late teens, I started just kind of struggling with identity, and throughout my 20s, it was mainly about religion. Do I really believe this? Um, what's the truth? Evolution or creation? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Am I choosing the right religion? Was Muhammad a real prophet, or was he, just this, sociopath? And all these questions just going on and on and on. And you can just get stuck in a loop studying hours every day, and you don't ever really truly find the answer. So that was a progression. But kind of the straw that broke the camel's back is once after I decided I no longer believe stuff the certain way that I did. I was living in Austin, working at Dell, and I just thought one day, what's the point? Why endure all this suffering? And I didn't have an answer, and it upset me so bad. I went home, left work for the day, and it just tore me apart. I didn't have an answer. What's the point of suffering? Why not just end it all? And you know, people talk about how powerful, hope is. Hopelessness is just as powerful in the other direction. Somebody who has no hope or no meaning in life. I mean, I'm still amazed every day and thankful because I have a beautiful life now that I survived it. Right. But that moment was, there at work one day. What's the point of all this suffering? And if you don't have answers to questions like that, or questions to meaning in your life in general, that's something that could tear at anybody, because those are important questions.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and and that really, I'm glad you mentioned and I'm not. It's not, it's very natural, and for me as well. I was double dipped in Christianity, went to Christian schools, went to Christian camps, and what happens with the mind is it is introduced to a lot of pragmatic thinking, scientific thinking, and then has to face its religious beliefs, and there has to be this decision made at some point as a child, like how do we fit the science and the religion model together, and one of the problems that I realized as I got into this personally was that it was the translation of religion itself that was faulty, that needed an overhaul. And I think that the literal interpretation of religion, to a large degree, was a part of the problem that no one around me was actually aware of. They were still just believing in
Right.
these literal interpretations, whenever it's allegory, mythology, and astrotheology, and all of these, parables and things, and the ancients never wrote things scientifically. Science, religion then was a blended thing. Now we have the schism, and I believe that's been manufactured by this Darwinian evolutionary model, which in my work in ancient amnesia we talk heavily into how that's a pretty cracked and broken model to begin with, and there's not a lot of evidence for it. In
Right.
fact, Darwin himself was a theist and went to church and was heavily involved in the church, but it was something that I had to again come to terms with. And when you do have that spiritual emergency, that tends to create a lot of trauma for somebody, because you really, really wanted to
Right.
believe in something, and religion is there to secure your psychology to a large degree. These ideas of how to behave, these ideas on your role in the world, and your perception of reality are really ingrained
Right.
inside these beliefs as a child. So when you lose all of that anchoring, it can be a really
Yeah.
incredible traumatic experience for people. And so I think that's pretty common, that people experience
Anchoring is a
that.
good word. Yeah.
Right. And if you talk to atheists, and me, I used to have a hobby arguing with atheists online, because it's also it's the most lowest retention belief system. It generally is a Christian like you, like us, that came and had and then became hateful of this what they would consider kind of brainwashing, that then they reflexively go, how dare you? And this is all bullshit and there's no meaning. And then they settle in with this phase of, well, there's just no meaning. It's all whatever. And there's no universal law. And we're all just meat sacks floating around until we die and there's darkness. And that's a pretty scary view of the world. And I think that's what's causing a lot of trauma in today's world, is this scientism that's spreading. So that's fascinating that you mentioned the religious aspect of it. And when that ended for you, when you were in this period of trauma, what is it that brought you, I guess, into the next phase? You were in this traumatic phase psychologically. You then started to I guess, go down a therapeutic route, or what was your next move?
Well, it was progressive. All throughout my 20s, whenever all this was building up, I was seeing therapists on and off, taking different medication. Um, Whenever I really realized my problem was serious enough to where I couldn't work, I was in and out of a job and I just couldn't function in the adult world and work. I went to a treatment center, and then, that didn't help. And I got back to Austin and still couldn't function. That's when things really, really took a dark turn. Um, not to get too far off topic, but to go back to something you said, talking about atheists. The vast majority of the people, no matter how they identify themselves spiritually or whatnot, they need some kind of belief system to turn to. Vast majority of atheists right now are what? Well, I don't call them liberals, they're more statists. They're on the left-leaning side of the current political spectrum, and they're all about big government control, which is not liberal. Extreme authoritarianism. That is a form of religion. It's a form of believing in something that's more powerful than yourself. So the same people who criticize Christians for looking to, their God as something that's bigger than themselves, they look to their government and their science as something that's bigger than them. So the vast majority of people are not strong enough to survive on their own. So they have to have some kind of belief system to look up to. I wanted to make that point because what happened with me can happen to anybody from any walk of life, coming from any belief system. It's been said that every adult, you have to be told at some time, and some people are told at 18, some people are told at 50, you can't play the child game anymore, you have to be an adult, right? Your brain kind of does that naturally. It has to come to a crossroads at some point, as far as, how to harmonize your childhood belief system and your adult belief system. So that crossroads for me was catastrophic. So to answer your question, going back to it, I ended up going to a treatment center after years and years of therapy didn't work. The treatment center didn't work either. So that's when I went back to the drawing board and said, no, I'm gonna have to do this myself. Hindsight's 2020, of course. If I had to do it all over again, the whole thing would have lasted a week if I know what I knew now, and I would have gone about it a whole lot differently. But the way I did go about it was just taking years to master my own mind the best I can. I don't possess any kind of special talent or power. So what I did, I think, is somebody that just about anybody can do it. So that is why I wrote the book. I want other people to be able to do, a similar thing. And sometimes they just need to be pointed in the right direction. So
Yeah, and I think that the beginning to anything
OCD.
of these issues is awareness of the problem, right? You have to find out what define the issue, and I think that's what you lay out really, really good in the book. I think if anything, that really is what can help people, is just to identify what OCD is, and what types of OCD there is, what kind of expressive behavior is involved in OCD,
Right.
and then unpacking those kind of details. So that people can say, listen, when we talk about fear, right, and what is fear, and you go into ancestral fear. Let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, obviously, fear is something that is a tool. It's used in the world to
Right.
protect us from danger. And so, could you explain a little bit about that reflexive fear, and maybe how that's useful, and yet also can become obsessive, and that was what leads to some of these malignant behaviors and these malignant reflexive psychology
Right.
tendencies. So
Well, that was probably my favorite chapter of the book to write. That fear chapter. I was going through my own struggle. I realized that my brain is just out of sense with reality. Why am I having this life and death struggle with fear every day? Whenever I live in, I had a good childhood. I live in a comfortable house with plenty of food. Why am I so damn fearful about everything? And then, it just becomes clear that, you know, for millions of years, human and human-like creatures faced actual threats, right? Our brains haven't changed that much, but the environments have, right? So whenever real threats to our survival are not there, our brain's going to find something else to fear the same way. And like we were talking about earlier, how the narratives are often controlled, the people who control the narratives know that, right? Look at COVID. They took advantage of pampered Westerners, right? And splashed, this scary new virus that's 10 times more deadly than the flu all over the news. And by the time the data came out, to disprove those myths, it didn't matter. The fear was already there. The narrative was already established, right? So people are just extremely easy to control, and the brain is super easy to lose control of itself. I lost control of my brain. I didn't think that was possible, but I mean, if you think about it, it makes sense, right? The brain is far and away the most sophisticated machine that we know of. That you can lose control of a vehicle, so why can you not lose control of your brain, right? It can happen, and it happened to me. But fear is a driving force behind OCD and any anxiety disorder. And it is interesting to notice that society has a lot to do with, in particular, Western society. The case has been made that America has some of the worst statistics when it comes to anxiety disorders. Well, is that because Americans are less mentally stable, or is it more that our society is more comfortable? Probably more the latter, right? Of course, it's not all or nothing. But when you look at people coming from the third world, they just, if you were to go to Haiti right now, do you think those people are talking about OCD or writing books like I did, or going to see counselors? No, they're more worried about when their next food is, when their next meal is going to come. Right.
Right. That's right.
So I just think that's a fascinating perspective that a lot of people don't consider. And psychiatrists really shouldn't miss it. The way they approach mental illness as a whole is feeding on that fear, treating people as helpless victims. If you go to a psychiatrist's office, you tell them you're struggling with anxiety, you're struggling with your job, you're struggling with your marriage, they're going to try to treat you like a helpless, pathetic animal, right? But that's not the way to survive. I mean, any biological being is designed to be strong and fit, So why does the industry not teach people how to be strong and fit, and adapt, as opposed to just being weak victims? So I think all that ties together.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think
and
that if
again, like I'm saying,
you were to take anybody with OCD and you were to make them go, or any psychological disorder, as they label it in psychiatry,
right,
and you were to make them go for 100 days and survive in the woods, I guarantee they would come out with probably half of their issues, back in society, because they would have to
right,
actually focus on reality, which was survival. Their fear would then be justified in terms of where it was directed, and them having to overcome all kinds of things in order to just live. Nowadays, we can live with fear very comfortably. We can live with OCD very comfortably. We can live with all these issues because we're granted this amazing
right.
Apparatus of foods and goods and services, and we don't really work that hard. Even when we think we work very hard, we really don't work that hard compared to our ancestors. They were really, really, killing themselves daily just to try to survive, essentially, with their effort and their lack of nutrition, all things that were going on. And so that is important to understand. And I think that perspective of the ancient world, I was talking about this earlier with a friend about some of these ideas of, male domination and feminism and all of these hot topics that are today. I said, we're comparing the modern world with with the ancient world. Like, oh, men were dominant back then. Women probably didn't even think anything of that because they were too busy trying to survive and raise families, and we all had no time to think of anything
Right.
else. We only had time to survive. We didn't have time
Yeah.
to sit there and ponder.
Try to give childbirth without dying.
Yeah,
Right.
without dying, you know what I mean? Like making sure the goods were coming in, making sure the horses were alive, making sure the house was still intact. I mean, that the other people around us weren't coming to rob us and things. So, those fears that you talk about, those were rational fears. They weren't irrational fears. They were rational because they were real and they
Right.
presented an actual life threat to themselves. Where today, a lot of this stuff seems to be like you said, it's allowing the mind to take control of itself to a large degree and then manifest all of these fears when there really isn't anything to fear besides um, you know maybe not getting to work on time or missing a show or it's very simple things that we blow up as to very, very big issues. So that is cool. What would you
And
what
then
would you
becomes a
describe it?
big issue.
What would you describe as irrational fears, as comparative to survival or rational fears?
That's one thing. I explain that in one of the chapters in my book. So no fear is 100% rational or 100% irrational. You talk to people with the worst OCD in the world. Do they obsess over whether or not the sky is blue? They don't, because they can go out and see it, right? So it's on a spectrum. An example of an irrational fear would be that you're too scared to get in a vehicle and go drive on the interstate, right? That's irrational. Not because it's impossible for you to get in a crash and die. That is possible, but it's irrational to the extent to where more harm than good could come out of not getting on the interstate. You might not be able to get to work and function and provide for your family. That's what's irrational, right? Um, fear can, like I was saying, sometimes the fear can be so great for comfortable Western men like us that it could become something serious. If you can't function at work, that's just as serious as someone out in the Sahara who has a broken leg and they can't hunt. Right? It becomes something super serious. And sometimes what has to happen is you have to tear down to rock bottom. That's what happened to me. I hit rock bottom and I had to rebuild from scratch. And I did recover 100%, and that's a point that has to be made. A lot of these psychiatric disturbances, you can heal from them, but a lot of times the establishment can't do it. Now, going back to your question, what's irrational fear and what's an irrational fear? That is extremely key to understanding, right? So the main treatment method of OCD is ERP, exposure and response prevention therapy, which is basically, so like, for example, if you're someone who washes your hands 100 times a day, you fear germs, right? Exposure and response prevention therapy would be expose yourself to the germs and slowly wash your hands less, right? That only works with irrational fears. And, I'll make another example of washing your hands. Is it irrational to fear germs? Not completely, because it is possible for any healthy person to catch a deadly disease and die, right? What's irrational is when you wash your hands to the extent to where it does more harm than good, right? I went to see a specialist, an OCD specialist in Austin, and this guy was known as one of the best OCD therapists around. He lived in a nice house, so he's done well for himself. Really, the only advice he gave me was, he said, treat OCD thoughts like guests at your dinner table. Let them sit down and let them have their way. Let them talk, let them communicate, but tell them, look, I'm not going to respond to you. You're just going to do your own thing, and I'm going to do my own thing, and then we'll be fine. And eventually they'll go away and everything will be peaceful. And I asked him, I said, wait a second. Now, what happens if those guests become hostile? What if they want to start stealing your food, go upstairs and rape your daughter, and then tear your house down? Are you still going to just sit there and let them do whatever? And he had no answer. I'm like, come on, man, you're one of the leading psychologists for OCD and you don't have an answer to that, right? So it's 100% essential to identify what fears are rational and what fears are irrational. And again, it's not all or nothing. You have to look at the bigger picture, right?
Yeah.
You have to do cost benefit analyses in your head. Is this fear serious enough for me to react to it in a way that would interrupt my normal everyday routine?
Right.
Right? Are germs dangerous? Yes, they are. But would it be healthy for me to spend 5 hours a day, trying to clean myself? No, because then I wouldn't be able to pay my bills, which is even more of a threat.
Right.
Right.
Right. Well, and
So,
on that argument, obviously it's actually germs that, it's healthy bacteria that keeps you alive too and produces the antibodies that, so, if you over sanitize, you actually become sick, so you want a healthy amount of germs and you want, so it's the right germs, right? Not the wrong germs. So there's kind of that leads into the idea of traditional OCD and versus obsessional OCD. It's not
right.
like you say, some of these behaviors are actually good. I mean, they're part of the human experience, and it's not about saying, oh, don't let them all in. Let's suppress, repress. It's more about integrate, understand, identify, analyze, and use them properly as a tool. Because
Right.
OCD is generally coming from people that have incredibly smart. They're smart people. They're very active minds, very sharp, very diligent. These people have tasking abilities like no other. They can burn through books, study through lessons. They can do all kinds of things. I mean, OCD is probably being played out on people that build the biggest Lego castles, or people that can, build the biggest sand castles in the world, or can draw and write all these crazy novels and paint all these paintings. They have,
That's
to
right.
some degree, a healthy OCD about that. It's, how do you channel that energy and not let it consume you to a certain degree? How do you make it positive? So is there, what is traditional OCD versus obsessional OCD?
Right. So traditional OCD is like a couple of the examples that I mentioned, like washing your hands, stuff that you can actually observe. Pure OCD is anything that goes on purely inside the brain. You can't observe it. But going back to what you said, even something like obsessive thoughts or excessive rituals, they're not all bad. The world is full of gray, even OCD. And it's interesting because pretty much it shouldn't be this way, but pretty much any psychologist or psychiatrist will tell you OCD is irrational, which kind of, and I talk about this in the book, that contradicts the treatment of exposure and response prevention therapy. You're supposed to gradually expose yourself for the fear. So you're, in that sense, you're supposed to gradually expose yourself to your condition. But then you go into a psychologist's office and they tell you your entire condition is irrational. Well, so how are you gonna convince this person to completely wipe out their condition, but at the same time gradually expose them to their fears? It doesn't make sense.
Hmm.
Um,
Fascinating.
but it's all about finding a balance. I mean, one thing that I have struggled to terms with after I did get better um, was the thought of well, am I completely healed, and what does that look like? Would it be logical for me to never have obsessive thoughts again? Well, not necessarily, because if it weren't for those obsessive thoughts, I wouldn't be as strong mentally as I am now. I wouldn't be as good a parent. I wouldn't be as good at my job. I developed a lot of very useful tools throughout my struggle, right? So it's very important to see everything, with the lens of gray. But going back to your question, what is the difference between traditional OCD and pure obsessional OCD? Pure obsessional OCD is inside the brain, and it's much harder to observe and it's much harder to treat, right? So if it's something to really keep in mind for anyone who knows someone struggling with it, you can't observe it, right? So if we can't observe it, their doctors can't observe it either, right? So those people are really kind of, on a limb of their own a lot of times, as I was for many years, and it can be just really hard to get out of. So I think that's what can make pure OCD more dangerous, because it can't be observed, and it can't be treated as easily. right?
Interesting. Is that
Um,
ties into the idea of the
the
problem
no
of
gender.
of labeling these things too, doesn't it? I mean, the problem of labeling is a huge issue because what could be natural tendencies are also then labeled as disorders to a large degree. I mean, if you look at the history of the DSM book, the Bible of Psychiatry, which I always thought was interesting. There's no actual chemical analysis going
Right.
on. There's no actual hard data. This is all just opinionated and like, oh well, and you hear these stories. My daughter, she's having these issues. They go in, they go, oh, she's got this issue, and the book keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, capturing almost any human behavior as a disorder. And I find that, I find it a little nefarious, to be honest. But can you talk a little bit about that issue, the problem with labeling these things, and some of the issues there?
Labeling absolutely huge when it comes to anything, but especially with mental health. If you take the big three: depression, anxiety, and OCD, right? So if you take two people with the exact same condition, you say one of them has an anxiety disorder, you say the other one is a little bit uptight and rigid, even though they have maybe the same symptoms, they're going to perform much different in society, right? The one who has a label is going to think differently about him or herself. Other people will see them differently too. Whereas the person without the label can accomplish much more because they don't have the same restraints. And it's interesting you mentioned the DSM because homosexuality is an excellent example of that. It used to be listed in the DSM as a disorder, right? So when it was in the DSM, homosexual people had that label. They were considered flawed, and they were considered, um, you know, someone who had to be treated like they had a problem, right? And now look, it's celebrated. So you have people with the same condition, they're homosexual, but now they're celebrated, they're thriving in society, whereas before they struggled. They had a much higher suicide rate. Their families didn't accept them. They had, trouble functioning at work, and it's just a perfect example of how powerful labels are.
Mm-hmm.
Not just mental health. Look at, we were talking about Facebook, right? 99% of Americans are fair-minded moderates and can agree on most issues. But with labeling comes tribalism, right? People put themselves on certain sides of the political aisle, and they gain, there's two different teams going at each other. I'm on this team, therefore I have to think that way. You're on that team, therefore you're thinking that way, and I don't like you, right? So labels are extremely powerful in every aspect of life. So knowing that, I try not to label myself with anything. When it comes to politics, I'm registered as an independent. I like the ability to think for myself and fall on any side of any issue, right? I don't like to think of myself as somebody who has OCD or had OCD. I'm somebody who struggled for a while and got over it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whereas as somebody who went through the same journey and still considers themselves as somebody with OCD, they're not going to accomplish nearly as much, right?
Mm-hmm.
We could go on and on with examples, but labels are extremely powerful, and it's something to keep in mind, you know, every
Well,
day.
that's amazing because when I was young and I was breaking out of my own kind of religious ideas and trying to understand what spirituality was, it was very common for the Christian Western mind to then move to the East and say, oh, well, look at this, Buddhistic type of, concepts and this oneness and all of these things. And it was very appetizing. I then came into the work of a guy named Jiddu Krishnamurti, who's very popular. I guess you can call him a philosopher, but he was more of kind of like a sage, and this guy blew the lid off of everything. He has a book called Total Freedom, and his message is essentially wrapped around labeling, that if you call yourself a Buddhist or you call yourself whatever, you're then compartmentalizing your identity into a certain set of rules and categories that you have to
Right,
then fit within that construct. You're
right,
essentially creating an acting character like in a movie,
right,
and then you're having to then fill that character's motives and histories and backgrounds, and the ego tends to do that. It tends to want to clothe itself in a certain apparatus of its own ideas so that it can then project that onto the public and then gain acceptance or rejection from that,
Right.
and then seek people that accept them, and then that creates tribalism and groups, and that's a tendency that happens. And so the idea behind the total freedom aspect is to allow things to come in, allow information to come in, allow concepts to come in, but try not to identify so much with those concepts and with those things. And this also goes into the mind. If you feel certain things or you have certain ideas, it doesn't mean that you have to identify so strongly with them and label yourself a certain thing. You just need to find your own magnetic north and what truth is to you, and but still keep that open
That's right.
mind and allow yourself to have this breakable, changeable sense of self, so that you can grow naturally, navigate through the
Right.
changes, because you learn and you change as you learn. And so that's a huge thing. And so labeling is a huge issue beyond even psychiatric disorders. It's really just about how we view ourselves and how we
Everything.
view life outside of ourselves too. So that's an excellent point.
Want to put yourself in a box. I I go back to one of my favorite lyrics from a Rush song. My mind is not for rent to any god or government. You don't want to put yourself, yeah, you don't want to put yourself in a box. I mean, we are constantly learning, evolving beings. A 90-year-old on his or her deathbed is still learning things every day, right? So you don't ever want to put yourself in a box. You don't ever want to keep learning or growing,
Mhm. Right. So you talk about in the book
physically or mentally.
a little bit about common OCD themes and putting them in perspective.
Right.
And one of them was checking. I thought that was interesting. And I want you to talk a little bit more about of that, because that's to me, even though it was like a short little thing, I thought it was pretty powerful about, um, you know, you talk about, you quote in the book that an other example of incompatibility of our primitive minds developed over millions of years, designed to survive being thrust into a modern comfortable world, our environment not being completely in order is one of the one more thing that is all too easy to fear. um, can you go into the idea of that? Because it goes back into the ancient world. We used to fight off hunger, disease, predators for our ancestors. Sometimes you say a door left unlocked or a stove can now all of a sudden be the same threat as a predator or something. And you see this very common. In fact, I've been in relationships like this where it's almost like you want there to be a problem so that you can validate the fear of
Right.
and then you may actually create that. You may leave the stove off so that you can check yourself and find that you did, so that you can say, oh, thank God I checked. And that becomes a vicious cycle. So what do you have to say about that fear? Because it's simple, but it's very powerful.
Well, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. If a true threat to your survival is not there, your brain is going to replace, that fear with something else, right? So our brains have not changed that much at all in millions of years, but our society has changed incredibly in the last 50 years. So there's an obvious, inevitable disconnect there that we're going to all have to get around. Now, I want to go back to something earlier too with labels in the DSM. So with the big three, anxiety, depression, and OCD, those are things that everybody has. OCD is just really all it is a doctor labeling you that you have, a problem that interferes with your daily life. But everybody um, performs certain rituals to reduce anxiety. And that's what OCD is whenever that becomes so extreme to where it interrupts your life. But it's something everybody does. Everybody checks their doors at night, sometimes a couple times. Everybody who has kids, especially, you check to make sure they're sleeping, repeatedly. So if that's what OCD is, everybody has it, right?
Mhm.
So it only becomes OCD when a doctor diagnoses it. But back to the fear aspect, it is interesting. Your brain will latch on to the biggest threat that's present. Somebody who lives in a really comfortable home, doesn't have to worry about finances or food. Sometimes their door being unlocked truly is their biggest fear. And in that sense, it's not necessarily irrational, like we were talking about earlier, right? So that's the trap your mind can fall into. true threats to your survival are not there. So it latches on to the biggest threat, and that is the biggest, that becomes a true threat to your survival. Turning the stove off, right? Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, the house could burn down. You could get, carbon monoxide poisoning. It could catch fire. Or if you leave it unlocked, somebody could come in and hurt your family. If you don't check your alarm clock enough and you don't wake up for work, you could, get in trouble or lose your job. So it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that those any kind of obsession that people have when it comes to checking, those are all rational fears. It just becomes irrational when they do it so much to where it interferes with their life, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
Absolutely.
it all comes down to a partly rational fear that's blown out of proportion,
Mm-hmm.
right? But like I was saying again, people who suffer with the kind of stuff, you can observe it, right? If you're somebody who shuts the doors too much at night, your spouse, or most likely can observe it, right? But if it's going on inside your head, it's not something you can observe. You can ask them, hey, is everything going on? Is everything going okay? They'll deny it. They'll say, yeah, I'm fine.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout all of my worst times, I always told people, yeah, I'm doing fine. What are you going to tell them? You're going to say, I know, I'm actually, I lost control of my mind. I'm lost in OCD. Or, what's the saying? Don't tell people about your problems, because 90% don't care. The other 10% are glad you have them, right?
Yeah. Well, and you can definitely tell this particular issue with the C19, that we've been dealing with for 2 years and plus now, is how much actual irrational fear and checking fear and things, people wearing plastic bags, wearing 9 masks and helmets and fireman gear and all these things just so they can go buy an apple at the grocery store, blows my mind, because they act as if
Right.
all of these things weren't there before. If there was no viruses out there, like there was no, I mean, people have been walking around next to people with pneumonia, walking around next to people with all kinds of transmissible viruses and diseases, and they didn't give a crap. Now all of a sudden there's some virus that's weaker than anything around, and they think they're going to die, and they're still wrapping themselves in cellophane and putting
Right.
blankets on anything they touch. And I think that your book is great because it's very timely, even though you wrote it 5 years ago. It really is showing what OCD really is in today's world and how much people actually have it. Every single person that's out there wearing masks and going crazy still has a large amount of this OCD, and they have not yet conquered that. Which is
And it's mainly just the West who have, been manipulated so much by the COVID fear, right? The third world countries, it's business as usual. They're COVID. I mean, yeah, I'm more likely to starve to death, than die from catching COVID. So it's mainly just the West who have really fallen victim to it. And, yeah.
Yeah.
How many people now have mask OCD?
I know, exactly. It's like you said, that the more cush the society, the more the fears have to be replaced, and they're replaced by the simplest, silly things. Like I'm
Right.
afraid to drive. I'm afraid to fly in an airplane. I'm afraid to do all of these things, because you want to manifest some sense of insecurity, and that's what I want to get to next. Is this idea of the harm OCD. And I've always said in my show that people talk about security, and I think it's an interesting word because there's really no such thing as security. First off, we're born to die. We're basically walking towards our own destruction every day. There's no such thing as
Right.
living forever. We are literally, built to die, right? So what is security? I mean, death is the ultimate insecurity, right? Well, that is inevitable. Therefore, I don't believe security really is something that truly exists. I think that uncertainty is something that always exists, and you have to be comfortable with the lack of security more than try to force security to be there, because there's no such thing. I mean, to a large degree.
That's right. So, security is on a spectrum. Nobody is 100% secure, 100% insecure. Um, Now, one quick side point on all these, I was trying to reach a broad spectrum of readers when I wrote the book, but my main expertise is really on the pure OCD, particularly when it comes to religion. I did obsess so much that I started, obsessing over my own obsession. Am I ever going to, get better? That's kind of what it turned into. Um, but that's my main area of expertise. I kind of just touched on all these other, you know, um, themes, but they all have a common, pattern. And when it comes to harm OCD, that's one example of a lack of security. And all these obsessions do. Somebody who struggles with their religion, they don't feel secure with their belief system, right? Someone who struggles with their sexuality, they don't feel secure in their marriage or their society, or how they might be accepted. Somebody who struggles with harm OCD, they don't feel secure with themselves and if they're safe around their loved ones, right? So all these fears, it is a matter of, a lack of security. And that goes back to what I was telling you earlier. I in my childhood, I did have a general lack of sense of security and acceptance in who I was. If that by itself existed, independently, it wouldn't have turned into OCD. So that's one of the layers. Harm OCD, it's not something I have experienced, but I've talked to several people who have experienced it. And, it's kind of, it goes into play like all these other rituals. Someone will fear that they're capable of harming one of their loved ones. Is that irrational? Not 100%, because anybody is physically capable of harming somebody they love, right? So it's not rational to say that fear is completely unfounded. And by the way, like I said, just about every mental health professional makes that mistake. They say, well, that's irrational. You would never hurt your loved one. And then the person they're telling that to, their subconscious mind knows that's bullshit. They know they are capable of harming a loved one. So then their mind is at a conflict with each other, right? Or with itself. So what happens with people who struggle with harm OCD is, it becomes a competitive or repetitive cycle in their mind. Would I ever harm my child? No, I wouldn't. How do you know? Well, because of this. Well, how do you know? Because of this, and it just turns into an endless loop, right? And it's a vicious cycle. The more they fear that, the more they perform those rituals in their mind to convince themselves they're not capable of violence. The more they try to convince themselves they're not capable of violence, the more they have fear. And it's just a vicious cycle, right? It's the same thing in all of these themes. And once you understand the general concept, you can really notice the same pattern in pretty much every fear cycle. And that's what I was able to do. I was able to notice the cycle and understand, the overall pattern of OCD. So no matter what my OCD fear was, I was able to use the same concepts to kind of cope with it, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's a good point. And you're right. I mean, going in a little bit deeper about, the mankind, we talk about this on our podcast all the time as we unpack what it is to be human. We believe in our work that, we are a spiritual being having a human experience. And when we come in, we kind of forget where we came from. We forget us as a soul, and we're left with this kind of schism of fear because we're confused. Where are we? Why are we here? Where are we going? We're kind of like lost. Where's my home? And that, I think that's part of just the human experience. And we tend to be left in the middle between polarizing positive, polarizing negative, polarizing towards love and light, polarizing toward darkness and evil. And so everyone has the capability of deciding where to go. And just like the yin and yang symbol, we always have a piece of the darkness and the piece of light, no matter what polarization we're a part of. And so we're given free will to then decide what we do with our power. Everyone knows that deep down we can all be triggered to kill somebody. We can be triggered, whether it's a threat to our family. Someone comes in, they start pointing a gun at your daughter. You're going to blow them away. You're not going to think twice. You're going to just protect the family. If someone were to hurt your wife or anything like that, you would have thoughts of murdering this person. Even if she came off safely, you would still have these really, really dark thoughts. And all of us are capable of these dark, things. So that harm OCD is something that, again, is a very natural thing that's kind of born out of our survival mechanisms that go back thousands and thousands of years in ancient history. So, that's a really good chapter. I think that it's good for people to understand that. And again, the book is really just about bringing to awareness that OCD is really all these different types of OCD is really just parts of human behavior, parts of natural tendencies that come out of our human experience, and it's okay. It's just a matter of making sure they're not obsessive, making sure they're not controlling you, making sure that you have the power to use them as you see fit to better your life. Like you said, you've built an amazing life using some of these skills that you used to call ailments or problems or disorders. I think another one that is really important is the relationship OCD, because this ties into more how we see ourselves in our job and in society, also about love and our partners and our chosen mates. What exactly can you talk about a little bit more about relationship OCD?
Well, like I mentioned, it follows the same pattern. People who struggle with that, they feel a lack of security in their relationship. So they try to combat that lack of security with mental or overt rituals to try to convince themselves that that fear is irrational. Like, no, the doubt of my marriage is irrational. This is why. That's why. Okay, so the doubt returns. Okay, well, again, that fear is irrational because of this and this. Now, one thing that's really important to understand about OCD is that it's almost always a battle between your subconscious mind and your conscious mind, right? Your subconscious mind is just deep rooted memories, thoughts, and understanding of the world. And your conscious mind is what you try to tell yourself, at that moment, right? So people who struggle with relationship OCD, they have these deep rooted insecurities about the relationship, and they're consciously trying to tell themselves that that fear is irrational. And again, it's like a vicious cycle. The more you try to tell yourself your relationship is perfectly fine, the more you're gonna doubt. The more you doubt, the worse those rituals are going to be, right? And it goes into a vicious cycle. Like I said, all these patterns are the same. Um, what's the solution? There's no perfect solution except finding a place to where your subconscious and your conscious mind are in harmony. And sometimes that's going to be pretty harsh, right? If you're somebody who has an overweight spouse and you struggle with that, the answer is not to try to tell yourself, no, they're actually, fit and beautiful, and I'm perfectly attracted to them, and that fear is irrational. No, it's to be at peace with the way things are, right? And I could say the same thing about any of these. Let's go back to the last one, harm OCD. Is the answer to tell yourself, no, I would never harm my child, I would never harm someone I love? No, the answer is to be at peace with yourself as a savage human being. It hasn't changed that much over the last couple thousand years, but society has changed, right? Am I capable of harming someone I love? Yes. Would I do it? No. That's how your subconscious and your conscious mind can be in harmony with each other, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's essentially what I did with all of these OCD themes that I have. Do I believe the religion the way I did as a child? No, but I learned lessons from it, and it's helped me as an adult, right? So I think that's 100% key for anybody with OCD. Find a way for your subconscious and your conscious mind to be at harmony with each other. And then, don't try to change who you are, right? And that goes back again to labeling. If you tell someone that has OCD that they are ill and they need to be cured, it's going to affect them in all kind of ways, and it's going to prevent them from using those characteristics to their to their benefit. We can use prominent religious figures as an example. Someone like Jesus, who ruminated out in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, right? Regardless of where you are or what you believe spiritually, that is classic pure OCD, right? So what if Jesus, without any of his divine powers, if you believe he had that, was convinced at an early age, you are somebody who's mentally ill. All those thoughts that you have are a problem. You need to be cured. He wouldn't have been able to accomplish what he did, right? So that was the transition that was really beneficial for me. I'm still an obsessive person. I just found ways to obsess in the right ways, right? I obsess at work. I take care. I have an extremely keen attention to detail at work. I don't leave, the day till all my customers are taken care of. I check my orders 4 or 5 times, to make sure that there's no problems. You know, I follow up on everything. So all that would be considered obsessive compulsive behavior, but it's beneficial, right? I'm able to make a good living and finish, top 2 or 3 in the country right now every year. So it's sorry, what was the original
well,
question? Talking about
it
relationships.
seems to be,
I went off topic a little bit.
it seems to be that acceptance and awareness seems to be the quote unquote cure for this type of thing. It's not about anything besides saying like what am I as a human? And I think that's the huge part of it is that people come in and they say, I mean, there are so many possibilities to how to be a person, how to express yourself nowadays. I think that's part of the neuroticism that comes out of modern society. I remember that as a child. What do I want to be? Do I want to be, what do I want to be as a career? How do I want to express myself as a personality? What kind of friends do I want to have? What kind of sports do I want to play? I mean, there's so many options now. You used to just do what your dad did. You used to just, get past the baton from, you get the, your dad can't walk anymore. You pick up, raising the horses and having the kids and doing the same thing. Nowadays, we can do anything and everything. And that comes with a sense of, I think, kind of a neurotic kind of like questioning, what is it do I really want to do? And I think that one of the first keys is just to relax and accept that there's going to be so many things in front of you. You just need to walk forward and listen to your mind, watch yourself, be more self-aware of your tendencies. And if you find yourself obsessing, like you said, point it in a direction that serves your interest and watch yourself then
Right.
bloom, because that's the key, is that it's a tool. If you let it control you, you may end up scrubbing the corners of the kitchen, obsessing. If you use it to your advantage, it could be double checking, triple checking your double check at work, making sure that the orders are in, making sure that you contacted that customer. And from the customer's viewpoint, from the business viewpoint, they're going to see that as a very beneficial type of behavior. They want that kind of security when they're making transactions, and they're going to come to you, and you're going to benefit. Your family's going to benefit from that. And so I think a lot of it is more about awareness, identifying, and then directing, and being the master of these behaviors, these natural tendencies. And I find this true with people that are introverts. I used to kind of, think there was something wrong with people. I have a very extroverted personality. There's a lot of people that are tucked in, and I look at them as kind of like, what's wrong with that guy? A lot of people, they just don't want to pour out. Their natural tendency is to stay tucked in. That's okay. People have that tendency. They're good at other things. They're going to be better than me than at other things that I'm not good at. So we have to first, be aware of the issues, and then find acceptance of those behaviors. And then once you accept it, you can then move to the directive aspect of it. Where like, how am I going to then use this to my advantage? And that's when you truly overcome it, because now you're driving that OCD behavior into the lane that you want, and it's heading in the direction that you want it to
Right.
go. And so I think that's that's at least my take on it. And I think even in your conclusion, you kind of mentioned something to that degree, where you just have to
Right.
accept it, right?
Live as yourself. There's no better way to live. And you have to accept it on a very deep level. Mindfulness and awareness of the moment is something that's, taught extremely commonly in mental health. But if you have a dumpster going on, in your mind, and you have that conscious, subconscious, battle going on, like I mentioned, and you're just sitting there meditating, it's not going to hardly do much, right? You're really just kind of putting a band-aid on the fire. So you have to accept it at a truly deep level, and you have to really go back to the beginning and be willing to learn it all. Now, it is effective. I'm living proof of it. But the issue is that not everybody's capable of doing that. Just like anything else, people have different, you know, um, capabilities, right? I look at your arms, man. I can't get arms like that. It's just not my genetic potential. Um, just some people who can run a mile in 4 minutes. The vast majority of people just don't have the genetic capability, right? Not everybody is capable of completely tearing down their belief system and rebuilding it, right? Which is why I said what I did at the beginning. I don't necessarily think mainstream modern medicine should be done a whole lot differently. I mean, other than with little tweaks here and there that we mentioned. I don't think they should start going in and telling people some of the stuff that I'm saying, right? Just not a lot of people are capable. I mean, you have to be creative in your thoughts, and most people aren't creative, right?
That's right.
So I think it's super important for people that struggle with OCD to know what they're capable of, but most importantly, to understand these concepts and find their own cure. And then once you do feel like you've cured yourself from your actual problem, turn it into something good, because you're not going to change who you are. You're not going to all of a sudden not be an obsessive person. You just have to obsess over the right things, right?
That's right. That's
and
right.
You have to obsess in healthy ways, and you have to keep a balance on your whole life, right?
What I was saying is that I know that you're not a bullshitter, because when you told me you wrote a book on overcoming overthinking, I said, well, Austin's a smart guy, and we've had conversations 10 miles long on social media. So I expected to kind of, take me a month or so to get through this book. And then I realized that, the book was, not very big. And I said, well, shit, the son of a bitch did overcome overthinking. He was able to write a book.
Didn't overwrite.
It wasn't 300 pages long. So I guess that's proof in itself that an OCD guy can write a book and not feel like he has to keep writing, right?
Well, some of the things you love about yourself are some of the things you hate, right? So I overthink and I overdo so much stuff that I can't stand overwriting or overreading. Whenever I read books and it's just page after page of fluff, and I'm just like, get to the damn point, or even work meetings. I joke with my boss all the time. Could that meeting have been an email with 5 bullet points? I'm super to the point. So hell yeah, I wanted my book to be to the point.
Yes.
I wanted people to be able to read it in one sitting and get something out of it.
That's a beautiful
without it, like I said, without having to read page and page of fluff, and then you miss the main point. I'd much rather a book that you can sit down and read in an hour and you get something out of it.
Right. And that's really what it is. And honestly, today's world, everybody's got the attention span of a fruit fly, and the better we can compact information and make it available in bites, the better, because it's going to lead people to more self-discovery when we do it that way, instead of picking up a book on ancient philosophy, which I've done. I find that stuff really, I am a little OCD about reading really dense and heavy material. I like that stuff. But most people, they need things that are snackable, that they can read quickly, listen to quickly. And I think you did a really good job. I actually learned a lot about, these topics and OCD itself, and started to look at my own self, saying, what am I OCD? Because everybody, again, does have forms of this. So again, self-awareness is the key. And I think you did a really, really amazing job just presenting this stuff, getting it available for people to understand. So I appreciate you doing that. I've known you for a while, and your journey has been awesome just to witness. So congratulations on your children, your job, your wife, your life, everything that you've done. You're still young. You have so much to do, and I'm sure that there may be another book in the future that you may write about other topics. And I sure as hell would love to have you on again, just unpacking these concepts and ideas, and then going from there.
Sounds good, man. Yeah, I'd love to come back anytime. Appreciate you having me. We'll keep it simple. We'll keep it real anytime, man.
That's right. So keeping it simple isn't so stupid. Because that's the phrase, right? Keep it simple, stupid. But again, I just want to say thank you.
Right.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. We had a really great chat. We're going to be tapping you again soon, and then I have some other people that are wanting to have you on as well. Some people in the more self-help sphere. I think you would fit really, really nicely in those environments, and talking about the mind and just unpacking what it is to be a human on a daily basis. And I think that's a huge tool for people. to have these 10, 15-minute conversations about certain topics, because our mind is constantly flowing with information. And the more we can understand it, be self-aware of it, and guide it and control it, the better our life becomes as we kind of manifest and create our future. It all starts in the mind. So I hope to see you on other shows as well, upcoming soon. And again, we just want to thank you for being here.
Yeah, likewise, man. Thanks for having me on. I'm available. We'll keep in touch and we'll make it happen again.
All right, bud. Well, have a good day, and we will talk soon.